Okay, so this webinar is being recorded. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Antal. I'm the Youth Services Consultant at the South Carolina State Library. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the new media literacy with Carrie Rogers-Whitehead. She is joining us from warm and sunny Utah this morning. Carrie, a few housekeeping things first. Go ahead and do please remember to keep your microphones muted unless you're asking a question. We've got a small enough group here this morning that I think we can have a lot more of a discussion type presentation this morning, or feel free to type your questions in the chat. Let's see, we do have closed captioning available. That's down at the bottom. If you click on it, there may be a box that says CC, or you can click on the three dots that say more, and the live transcript will be an option. Again, this webinar will be recorded and will be posted up on our YouTube Youth Services Continuing Education playlist for later access. All right, Carrie, take it away.
No, thanks, Rebecca. I spoke earlier, was it a couple months ago on online safety with all y'all. I wasn't sure if it was any of you in that group. We had a great discussion about all like the trends and technology and everything that's affecting us. And we're going to dive more into technology in this presentation. I call it the new media literacy. I just made up that name, but like updating media literacy for the 21st century, and what are the trends going around? How does that impact how we need to talk about these things, strategies for discussing and teaching and understanding it. I kind of joke around, like media literacy's been the rage, I guess, since 2016, and a lot of our politics got a little crazy. So, but I was kind of joking with like someone who asked me to speak about this, like a business person, and I'm like, librarians have been doing this for like ever. You are all ahead of the media literacy train. You've been talking about this for a very, very long time. And it just sometimes feels like the rest of the world is like, oh, wow, maybe media literacy is important. So I appreciate librarians and all they do, and know that you're ahead of the curve here. And I'm trying to keep us ahead of the curve, because as technology changes, so do we need to change. So I apologize. I have two screens. So I'm kind of looking back this morning, and Rebecca's saying, please go in there and chat. I'll look back for your chats. And I have some discussion questions, because we're going to talk about some kind of big issues here and that affect all of us. So I'd love to hear what you have to say and your strategies and what you think about this big topic there. So excited to get on in here. I'm going to talk a little bit, about probably stuff you already know, the importance of media literacy, and then I'm going to dive a while into tech trends. Then I'm going to talk about how we consume media and how that's shifted, and how that also needs to shift how we talk about media literacy. I'm kind of covering what I say, the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, what, why, and I'm updating them for the new media literacy, these strategies there. So I'm going to be going through all the W's today and talking about technology, AI, when, how do you decipher websites, bots, all of it there, and then give some strategies for like, how do we teach and talk around how this new media literacy has happened there. So welcome. This is kind of adapted from an article I wrote for Connected Learning Alliance. I don't know if any of you follow them. They have some great work for librarians. They do a lot of like youth-centric and student-led learning, and they do talk a lot around technology and peace. They have a great blog and newsletter if you're wanting to stay on top of it. So this is from a blog post I wrote for them about updating the 5 W's. So not just doing the who, what, where, when, why, but going beyond there too. So I'm excited to talk about this. I presented this with Utah State Library a couple years ago, although I've updated it some because technology changes so quickly. Every time I do one of these, I have to go and tweak. I'm like, does that still exist? Has that changed there? So, but yes, I'm glad to chat about it with you. So great to have you, and let's dive in here. So let's talk a little bit about importance, and I'm going to talk about importance from from a student perspective and from a larger, bigger picture perspective here, it's just become more and more important from our students. And so many times librarians are the only ones who are doing it. Media literacy might be sprinkled in a few different subjects, but they're not always getting it in a very comprehensive way. And I was hearing from Rebecca, like, you have qualified media specialists at, all levels, elementary. In Utah, only 2 school districts have certified media specialists at an elementary level. So by the time kids get to middle school, that might be the first time they actually have some of this instruction. And I think that's too late in middle school by that point. And I know other states do it differently there, but yeah, they're kind of aides, and they don't have a lot of that training and that certification to provide this. And even then, I mean, I know school librarians are so busy because they're now the IT support department of their school. I worked with a lot of school librarians when I was a public librarian, and I had one of them tell me that she felt like around, oh gosh, like 70% of her job was just technology and support. And then the 30% was actually librarianship, because as more technology has gotten into schools, there's been more need for this help and support. And a lot of that's fallen on the backs of our school librarians, who don't always have time to teach. They have to troubleshoot. They have to run around. So I don't know if we have any school librarians here that want to share their thoughts. I can only discuss what I'm talking about with school librarians as well. So it's a big deal, and it's not always being done. So a kid might be older until they encounter some of this, or it might just kind of be this very haphazard approach. Here and there, maybe a little bit in English class, a little bit in other classes, but they're not getting some of this comprehensive education until maybe even high school, or even then. I'm an adjunct professor, and I can say from a college level, oh, it's pretty rough. It's pretty rough. I have to teach college students about what good sources are, and my brain is like, you're 20, shouldn't you know this by now? But they don't. That sometimes my introduction in my classes is like some of the first they get it. So we need media literacy. It's not always happening in schools, and it affects like our public trust in institutions. So this is from a Pew Research study that in 2020, just 20% of US adults said they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing. We're also seeing this decline in trust in like the CDC. We've seen that a lot with the vaccination and public health guidance. We've seen this with a lot of institutions. Interestingly, librarians are still one of the most trusted public institutions out there. Y'all are up there with like firefighters. I mean, firefighters, right? At the top there. So there's still some trust in these institutions, but as this trust decays because of the issues of media, that makes people not want to listen, and that is a public health issue, as we've seen, and that's caused other issues. I don't know if anyone wants to chime in about maybe things that they've seen, but when I look at media literacy, I kind of look at it as a democratic thing. How does this affect democracy? How does this affect public trust? And when you don't have that public trust in institutions, then you have nihilism, you have cynicism, or you have anarchism. You have kind of like people discarding it. And I work with a lot of young people teaching media literacy as part of digital citizenship. And something that I found is that they just don't trust anything. And I get it. Like sometimes it feels like you can't trust anything, but when you don't trust anything, there is research to show that those who don't trust anything are more likely to fall for like conspiracy theories and get into those kind of things because they don't trust anything in the mainstream. So some YouTuber or someone on 4chan can really sway them without any evidence there. So I've run into flat earther high school students, and I thought they were joking and trolling me at first, but no, they weren't. So it's hard to see idealistic young people just giving up completely. And that's a struggle that I've seen as well. So, but Americans say that this is important, but they feel a little overwhelmed. I don't know if any of you feel overwhelmed as well. So that was a Pew Research study. This is from Gallup and Knight, that the vast majority of Americans, 84%, say the news media is critical or very important to democracy. But 3/4 say they see too much bias. And 4 and 5 say that misinformation is a major problem. And then this stat, this relates to those high school students I was referring to. 17% of Americans are so overwhelmed, they have stopped paying attention. I forgot to put a word there, paying attention to news altogether. So I don't know if any of you have felt in this category. I know sometimes I do, and I'm like a news junkie. I like subscribe to a bunch of different sources myself, but sometimes I can feel a little overwhelmed too. It's also this feeling of like, I can't do anything. It's hopeless. It doesn't matter. You know, you just feel like, oh, it's just so much information there. But when you have like this opting out, that doesn't help us, that doesn't help our trust in institutions. It makes it harder for librarians and governments and educators to do their job. It's hard to have some unifying principles to get policies and things enacted and done. So I don't know if you ever felt that way. I sometimes can feel overwhelmed, but I wanted to talk about media literacy as like a public good is a way to look at this. There's been talks about like, how do we reframe the news as a public good? But right now it's pretty rough out there. It's pretty rough. And there's lots of reasons, economic reasons, all sorts of reasons that there is this bias, but there is a lack of media literacy out there, and there's a lack of trust. You have to have some sort of trust to be able to be a little bit media literate, because you got to be able to consume the media. So that's a big picture, and we'll kind of touch on that here and there as we go through, especially as we talk about technology, which is part of the reasons we have a lot of this distrust in media, which affects our lack of media literacy. But it's also part of our education standards. And you know some of this, and you probably have some South Carolina standards as well, you know, that might be separate out there, but it's in the Common Core, the integration of knowledge ideas. It's in ISTE standards of students as a knowledge constructor in other various places. If you look at a lot of the American Association of School Librarian standards, I really like theirs. They have some great standards around media literacy and how it connects with lots of different things. It's kind of like this big umbrella that you can have in science class, you can have in health class, you can have in English class, you can have all sorts of classes, but it's not always done in a very systematic way, because who actually has to follow the standards and test to it is not necessarily your health educator, not necessarily these these teachers that have to do it. So it gets kind of lost in the shuffle sometimes, right? So this is where some of you can find it in education standards. I like to use the ISTE standards, but I also do like AASL standards for media literacy. NOMLY, if you're familiar with NAM, I'll just type it, like nomly.net is their website. They have some great media literacy standards, and they have some actually great stats about media literacy education in general. And well, I shouldn't say great stats, they're kind of depressing a little bit, but they have some stats and things out there, but it's part of our education standards. But as I was saying earlier, sometimes our librarians, our school librarians are so overwhelmed, or they don't even get the kids that much, or they can't get into the classroom and they're running around being tech support, that some of this is not as comprehensive as it could be. So yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for sharing some of those standards around media literacy. I think it's helpful for public librarians to understand the education standards so you can support those school librarians as well.
When we see families, you know, the schools and the school librarians, they don't see the whole family most of the time, whereas in the public libraries, we get to speak with, influence the entire family, show the entire family these resources. And so it's important that we be able to speak some of the same standard language as the schools, not just for our own believability, but so that the parents understand a little bit more about where their child is at and what their child is learning.
Yeah. And a lot of this comes from the parents too. It's like the norms you have in a household around the news or around media. What do the parents think too? If they're going to try to support this, then they need to understand a little bit of it as well. I mean, trust me, I think media literacy education should not just be for kids. Adults really need this
totally for adults too. Yes, and that's one of the things that I'm hoping, you know, that folks take away from this is media literacy is not just something that we need to be constantly reinforcing with kids and with the school teachers, but also with the parents. There's a big gap out there, and I was going to say earlier, you know, there are days when I'm just like I cannot read another news story.
Yeah.
because I'm so tired of the work that it takes to sort through the bias on either side and figure out what actually is being said or what actually happened. It's exhausting, but it's also part of our responsibility. We live in a democracy. It's part of our responsibility as citizens. And you can like that or not like it or not trust the media or whatever, but I'm sorry, it's part of our responsibility. Just like getting up and getting out and voting is to understand what's going on in our world just a little bit more every day.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Rebecca. And I'm glad you mentioned the parents. And I didn't include this, but I was going to mention, if you're looking for more media literacy education like on your own, Arizona State University, their Walter Cronkite School of Journalism has a free great course with media literacy that was funded, I think, through the Zuckerberg-Chan, which is a little ironic in that way, the Zuckerberg-Chan Foundation. So, but it actually is a good curriculum. And I was talking to their director, who has taught media literacy for years around adults, and I was talking about how that had changed. Dr. Roski, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and she was saying that like a few years ago she felt like she could share different sources and say, hey, here are like where things are on the right and the left but people wouldn't even want to accept certain sources that she felt were mainstream sources. But it was hard for her to talk about media literacy when there wasn't even a standard of what was good media. So that's another issue. But I remember her saying that. She's like, what am I supposed to do here if the Associated Press is suspect? How do I teach this, right? So it's an issue with adults too. So she teaches college students there and has found struggles with it. But it's a great course out there. And I'm sorry, I should have included the link if you want to dive into more. But I just want to pause if you have anything you want to add. I've been talking about like democracy and public trust in institutions, education, all of this around the importance of media literacy. If anyone else wants to add what they think or something I'm missing, or what do you think about media literacy? And I'll pause there for a second, but yeah, we have a smaller group. So if anyone wants to kind of raise their hand and say something, that's good too. Yes, I can't. Give everyone a second before I move on. And you can always keep chatting in the box there. Okay. We'll dive on in here into the tech. I'm going to talk about tech trends pretty much for the rest. I'm going to reference this for the rest of the presentation about, this is probably also going to describe of how we got into the situation where 17% of Americans say they don't want to look at the news at all. So what are these tech trends and what's going on a little bit? And some of this you might already know, some of it you might not, but I want to spend a little bit time talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and how we have better technology. That's just from a graphic, and I was researching, writing on deep fakes, about how we have better technology to make it harder to differentiate information. And a deep fake is just one example of that. It's machine learning generated images. So basically the machine learns like where like the person's supposed to move, I guess, like in a video, and it tracks it out. So the movements look really realistic as opposed to like stuttery kind of automation CGI graphics there. So it's made this easier and cheaper to do. So we've had like CGI for years in movies. You might have seen that. And I'm trying to remember the exact stat, but when that was like The Hobbit came out, do you remember The Hobbit? Maybe you don't want to remember it because Lord of the Rings was so great, and then they made The Hobbit, and they made 3 of them. But it was out in like 2014, and I was reading that it was one of the most expensive movies ever made because of all the CGI work that they had to do. But if that movie was made now, it would be significantly cheaper because they had to have like a team of 30 people to actually like. Every time Legolas would like move, they'd have to like move everything on the screen to make him move. And then the machine figures out how to make them move. So it's so much easier and actually be significantly cheaper to do that movie now with CGI. So that's, but when I say deep fake is that, so we have a lot of data on the internet. We got our voices, we got our pictures, we got our videos, and all of that data can help the machine learn how that person looks, what they're doing, all of it there. So a lot of the deep fakes started with celebrities. It actually started with pornography on celebrities because a lot of technology starts with porn. But it started there. Oh yeah, I wanted so much from the Hobbit movies. But it started there because there was just a lot of data. So when you have deep fakes, it's often by public figures or celebrities out there. But as we get more and more data, we keep uploading more and more videos. It gets easier for machines to do their job. They're learning from what we share. So I'm not going to show this video. I don't know if the link will work anyways, but there was a video made of a deepfake video made a few years ago when this is Obama, and they've improved since then of like him speaking, and it does look really realistic. But if you Google deep fake videos, there's some of Trump, there's some of Obama, there's some of, I think, Putin out there, there's some of Angela Merkel, a lot of political leaders have these deep fake videos where it looks very, very realistic of them speaking. They sound the same, all of that kind of stuff. Now, how this relates to media literacy is that, I mean, so much the adage has been like, oh, well, if there's a video, well, that's proof, right? But like, what if we start like eroding our trust in videos? That was kind of like a gold standard, right? Like maybe the photograph, and now people are like, oh, Photoshop, but no, a video is okay. Oh, I don't know about the video anymore. There's been documented cases of these being made. And what does that mean? If people can't trust the videos, if this is easier to make and create than before, what does it mean for media literacy? And how are we talking about this? And how do we navigate this landscape versus just, biased sources? Well, we'll talk about biased sources here, but we're talking about tech right now. And there's a bunch of computer generated images. This is from an article with Washington Post, and these are all fake people in this picture. It's easier to get to tweak faces and things, and this could be an issue with like dating profiles out there or bots or whatever it is, because I taught this to kids, and I still think it's good advice to do a reverse Google image search, right? And so like, who is this person? Is this an actual person? But that's harder to do if AI can like make the picture makes sense there too. So these are all fake people, and I don't know about you, but I don't think I can't tell that they're fake. I don't tell they're fake. You have to tell me this is fake. It looks real to me. So there's been improvement not only in videos, but in images to create the faces. So there's different software and stuff out there, and it might just take it almost takes a face and kind of tweaks it a little bit to make it a little bit unique. But this also kind of like muddies the water a little bit. And especially for in terms of like romance scams, catfishing, all of those kind of profiles, or things like bots. You have these images that they look really, really real than more than before. And so then we talk about videos, we talk about photos, you have to talk about text. This is AI generated voices, and Lyrebird is just one example of them out there. They're part of an AI research division that it can sound just like the voice. You can write in the text and then it sounds like the person. Now we're already seeing this a lot with like virtual assistants. So a virtual assistant can like take a call, can schedule something, and all of that's an AI generated voice. Has anyone used any of those virtual assistant tools? I haven't. I've just used real people to that, but they they sound alike. They can call a place and say, hey, I want to, pick up some takeout, and they do these type of tasks for the person. Or, hey, I want to schedule this appointment, or they take a call and they sound really, really real, really real. So you can program them to do certain things and have them help you out, but none of it yet. Yeah, so this also, as I said, muddies the water. So if I can't trust everything I see and hear, it makes it harder to trust anything, and it makes you more likely to be like, well, I'm out. I don't trust anything. Doesn't mean anything. Nope. And that causes problems of its own, as we talked about there. So other kind of AI generated content. So this is from last July, and there's been other websites that have done that. Forbes has done this. I think Huffington Post has done this, is that it's just basically AI generated like articles and content like that, or videos, or other kind of things. Wibbits and Wordsmith are two different tools that can do that. But I was a little bit disturbed when I saw this article about a bunch of journalists being being fired. There's been enough journalists that have been fired the last few years. Budget cuts in media, people not wanting to pay for their news, advertising revenue going down because of social media. So things were already really tough for journalists and writers out there. And then to have AI kind of, do some of that. Now, to a certain extent, this makes sense if it's a quick piece that you can just, maybe you're pulling something from the Associated Press and tweaking it for your content. Well, then AI can probably handle that. But what does that mean for like longer piece articles? I don't know. It's just weird to think that there is no author. This is an AI, and how do you know exactly what that is, and what is the implication of that? Now, maybe in some ways it can be better. Maybe there might be less bias, but I don't know. Put in input, you get an output. If we have a lot of bias already in our media ecosystem, it's going to create a lot of bias. And we're going to talk a little bit more about algorithms there too. But I wanted to mention that this. So I know Forbes has done it. A lot of those sites that have just regular content all the time. I don't know if Business Insider does, but some of those types, yeah, you're your Huffington Post, your lots and lots of content have been replaced by some of the AI. And there are user-generated AI can make different contents and videos and blogs too. You can record things with the voices, they can make stuff. And so there's always this feeling oh no, the creative arts are fine, right? AI will take the truck driver jobs away, but they won't take away these jobs. But they have, unfortunately, some of the jobs there. So we'll see how that progresses. But I wanted to ask, this is the big question that I'm kind of leading up to when talking about AI generated content, is how do we teach media literacy when we can't always trust what you see and hear? What does that look like? What is how do you talk to young people about this, or parents or patrons? Because you don't want to get them into nihilism, right? This is something I personally struggle with. I don't want them to give up. I really don't. I feel like they can do it, and it's possible. But I also want to be realistic with them about the media ecosystem too. So does anyone want to chime in about what you think? What happens? What do you do in this situation? You want to add? I'll pause for a second here. We're already a little overwhelmed. And then we got bots.
I don't even know what to say about AI generated news content. I'm just no, that's weird. No.
It feels weird. It feels uncomfortable.
It does.
But we probably read one we didn't know we were reading one.
Hello.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or want to share, or just want to sit here we can all sit here and thinking, what do we do?
Now what do we do?
Yeah. What do you do? How do you cite that source? Bot 439. I don't know. I'm supposed to do that, right? And to be fair, this is mainly appearing on those news aggregator sites. We have an appetite for 24/7 constant news, and it's really hard for humans to keep up with it. So we've kind of created this ourselves. We've cut budgets. We don't have the ads and subscription costs. We want news constantly. So part of this, what do you expect an organization to do at a certain point if they have to cut costs? But that's where a little bit we're at. But I don't see it necessarily going away, because it's not like we're necessarily paying more money for news.
Right.
So it's capitalism, I guess. You got to survive. But it's a question that I think about sometimes, and I wonder about, and I don't have the answer.
Well, there are no easy answers.
No. So that was my what. I talked about the 5 W's of new media literacy: who, what, where, when, why. I'm going to talk about the who and the where in this technology context there. So this is, and by the way, Russian was involved in both elections, by the way, but this was related to the 2016 election, Twitter bots spreading fake news. This was an FBI agent talking about how it's more simpler than you think to convince people of this. They look like you, they agree with you, they sound like you. And so it's like they only had to like spread the seeds, and then like we watered them. I guess we watered the weeds, because we have a propensity to retweet or share things that we agree with, that we have that confirmation bias, but we don't always look at like the veracity of that source, because it like feels good to us and it feels right. So a bunch of people were sharing bots and spreading that fake news because of that confirmation bias, that does that, like, oh yeah, that's a cool thing, I'll share it, but not necessarily thinking of it in a media literacy way. So let's talk about bots for a bit. This is from hashtag BotSpot, Digital Forensics Labs. There's other organizations out there kind of talking about that, but this is tough stuff. It's tough, like determining what pictures are real or what videos are real. But here are some advice from the Digital Forensics Lab if we are trying to figure out what is a bot. And this is a bot, if you can tell. But I will say they've gotten better. I mean, this just been a few years. They keep improving. It's like this arms race right now to keep going. And Twitter like knocks off a bunch of bots, and then they come back, and there's just kind of this back and forth everywhere. But like usually they're newer accounts. They retweet constantly, because they're basically, the job of a bot is just to magnify certain content. And this happens on the right and the left. Bots are designed all across the political spectrum. So if they're just retweeting, they're just amplifying other people's voices. They're not necessarily creating a lot of their own content with the bot. So you can look and see if it's do a reverse Google image search to look at the image of it. Sometimes you see stock photos and those kind of things. But as I said, sometimes our AI pictures are getting a little bit better. URL shorteners, I'm trying to think of a website that might do, but it's not the whole URL. It's like you plug it in and it gives you a little shortener, because you can only have so many characters in a tweet. But there are bots, not just on Twitter, of course, but they often amplify and spread certain content. And that's mostly what they do, is sharing, but it's kind of hard to know. But these are some tips to spot a bot there. And speaking of Twitter, I don't know if any of you have heard of Tay. This happened a few years ago. So Microsoft developed a public-facing AI Twitter bot. It learned from Twitter, and in 24 hours, it was spreading hate speech and saying to kill the Jews. So they brought it back again. They tweaked it. They tweaked it again and brought it back later that year. Same thing. This was the second Tay tweets there. So that relates to that algorithm, right? Like output, input in, and then you get the output. If all of Twitter, a bunch of Twitter is like hate speech, well, it's going to learn that like it didn't know if that's right or wrong. It's a bot. It doesn't have morals or values. It just does what it's told. So if it sees all this content, then it's going to amplify that content. And bots kind of do that. They have algorithmic, they follow different hashtags and what people are saying and amplify that content. But I felt like this was kind of a fascinating case study, and also a depressing case study as well, that it took a day for a Twitter bot to learn to say hate speech, because that's what it saw. I mean, what do you expect? So algorithms are an issue that we're going to keep talking about it. And if we are not talking about algorithms, when we talk about media literacy, we're really not addressing media literacy, because it's a huge part of understanding how algorithms work, how they affect us. All of that is part of it, but it's not necessarily included in traditional media literacy curriculum. Now, don't get me wrong, understanding and being able to look at a source and say who, what, where, when, why is great. That's a great place to start, but we have to kind of go beyond that, because the landscape has changed. If the who is a bot, if the who is an AI, if the where is social media, if the how is like by algorithms, well, that's a different landscape than how maybe I was taught that in library school. I was, had to research. So let's look at the database. Let's follow this. Let's look at the source. Let's look at all of it. We're going to talk more about that, but the landscape has definitely changed. So it's tricky to tell. Like, I think instead of like who, is there an author? Is it an AI? Is it a human? So here are some tips about, trying to determine if it's an AI or a human. Does it say on topic? A big one is it attributed? Did they say, like, if you authored something, you're typically going to have your name on it, and it's not going to have an author if it's necessarily AI. And does it make sense? Because things like slang and colloquial terms are trickier for AI to grasp. Those terms with like different gray meanings, or different cultural slang or regional slang is harder. But it's not like they can't do it. They can do slang. I mean, ask Siri or something, and you can get slang from Siri and you can get slang from Alexa, but it's trickier for them. And then they might have pauses or delays. So those are some ways to look at it, but evaluating content in this way, not just who is the author, is a way to try to help with this. So I'm going to move to, okay, so I gave you a lot of information on tech trends, the changing of the landscape. How do we actually teach this and educate this? What are some like practical tips? I mean, I included a few like questions you can ask, but what do we do? What do we do a little bit? And as I said earlier, I don't have all the answers. This is evolving and this is complicated, but here's some things that I can share that are some research-based information of tips. First of all is how we read. and I'm speaking to a group of librarians, so I know I'm speaking to the choir here. Like, I love a good long book, but it's a different style of reading with the book than if you're reading online typically. And a lot of how we consume information is through a tweet, through a blog post, through a paragraph, through a post. They're not long periods, and you can have a lot more depth and nuance in a 1,000-page book. I'm reading one right now. Like, you dive in really, really deep. A meme conveys information very simply and very black and white. So when we consume information, we're consuming these shortcuts, these quick bursts. We're not necessarily diving into the topic. And this affects how we evaluate it. A lot of these things, especially memes, are designed to hit our emotional triggers, right? So it's even harder to evaluate content when it is designed to like get you angry or upset or whatever. How do we evaluate that when our feelings are all over the place? So how we've reread is changed. And I don't know if any of you noticed that, because I feel like I have to switch my brain over sometimes to move back and forth from a book to the internet. It's like a different, I don't know how to describe it, a different way of learning, a different way of reading. I have to slow down. I look at things differently. And when I'm reading online, I'm reading quicker, and I'm just trying to aggregate a lot of information, but it's not necessarily deeper and it's not necessarily better. Now, there's a place for consuming information quick. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of information out there. Not everything has to be read in that degree of depth, but we do lose the nuance. We do not exactly evaluate things in those short and quick bursts. Okay. So let's talk about the whys first. Who, what, where, when, why. How do we address these things? I talk a lot when I work with students about self-reflection and knowing yourself. Now, that being said, we all have cognitive blind spots. This is sometimes what surveys find, is when people talk about biases, they're like, everyone else is biased, I'm the exception, right? We all have our cognitive biases. So this is hard for us. That's why we really got to like do this know thyself. I talked about it in like the Plato's know thyself, the Greek wisdom there. How do we examine our own biases? So when I talk to students, I actually don't always use the word bias, because that can be a bit of a loaded topic. Sometimes I do with the older kids sometimes, but I talk about bubbles. I say, what is your bubble? How did you create that bubble? What's in your bubble? I give the example of like, simple things. I don't like tomatoes. I can't stand them. So I have a bubble of anti-tomatoes, and I might not be willing to try a dish with tomatoes in it because I have a bias against tomatoes. And so I'm in my bubble. What bubble are you in? So I really encourage them to look at their bubbles. And I like to give those examples because we all do, but we don't always understand how our bubbles interact, how affect our interactions with the world. Like my bubbles around tomatoes are affecting me probably from getting some good curry. I really am. I'm limiting myself with my own biases and bubbles there too. So these are some strategies encouraging empathy. I do activities with kids where I show different media content And then I have them give their, like have them write on a Post-it. I'm like, what do you think? Immediately, give me your trigger thoughts right there. And I like to map them out and we discuss it, because you can have one piece of stimulus, one piece of content, and you can have a variety of different responses from young people there too. And thank you, Julie. Yes, you're not the only one who doesn't like tomatoes there too. And I appreciate, Melissa. Yeah, you read differently on a phone versus a computer. It's just a different way of consuming content, and it also affects how we evaluate content, right? I don't like even the types of computers. I don't like to work on a tablet because it encourages that reading consumption, because it's like that endless scroll, as opposed to a desktop where I have to click around. I feel like it's more active with my reading. So I even read differently on different devices. Mobile, I'm just trying to get in and out because it's a small screen. So depending on what device we're doing, our reading habits change too. And most people access the internet around the world with a mobile device. So that also affects how we're getting that information there too. So the whys, the what and when. So I talk about the emotional response. So in that activity, I was describing how I had students react to different stimuli, write their first thoughts. I have them also write their feelings. Like, what do you feel? Like, are you confused? Are you angry? Are you happy? Is it funny? And then I actually have like them map out like a degree of a spectrum of feelings on it. And because multiple people can react the same different ways. For some people, something's funny, it's a joke. For some people, it's, oh my gosh, that's horrible, why would you do that? But it's helpful, especially for young people who are just kind of in their heads, it's where they are developmentally, to understand how other people react to content. That just because you reacted this way, you felt this way, doesn't mean everybody did. So that empathy is important to build there too. So these are some questions you can ask on the what and when, the emotional response, and then when was it created? If it's a new account, it's more likely to be a bot. Was there a date? Was the message linked to other sources? And this is a question we could ask ourselves. Did I consume this message quickly, and what was my mental state? Did I see a post? Did I get angry and then I click on a link to read an article about that post? Well, when I'm in a different mental state, then I'm like, doing a research paper. What's this? Like, I'm kind of very open in one state, and I'm kind of angry and like upset in another state. And that's also going to affect how I'm going to evaluate that source. So I think especially with so much stimuli, so much information, that we need to talk more about our emotional states, not just about the who, what, where, when, why. We're going to talk about the we, the us there too, because we are creating our own algorithms. We create our own bubbles. We help create our own mental states, and that affects how we perceive all of the other bubbles there too. So this topic of moral convictions, I wanna mention. So I don't know if anyone, there was a great, if you're a podcaster, a great Hidden Brain episode on this that had Dr. Linda Sitka out there. She's got some research papers out there on this concept of moral convictions. So when I gave you the story of like, I have bias with tomatoes, that's like a preference. Now I'm not going to die on the hill for tomatoes. Like, I'm not going to like stir up drama. I'm not, like it's a preference. It's not a moral conviction. So moral convictions are, if I had a moral conviction around tomatoes, it would be tomatoes are awful and no one should eat them. They should be banned. That's a moral conviction versus, I don't like tomatoes. Great if you have them. So this is something we have to like look at a little bit, because sometimes online we have our preferences that we express, but it goes into this world of moral convictions. So she did a study that she had people walk into a room, and there were like two chairs, and they had like a pile of stuff on one of the chairs, and she asked the people who would come in, oh, that person's gone to the bathroom, and then she would share their political preference. Oh, that person is for abortion or against abortion. They're in the bathroom, they're coming back. And then they would actually track of their own feelings on like hot button issues. And they would track how they would position themselves. And people who disagreed would physically take the other chair and move it away. They actually they measured the distance. So we distance ourselves for those things as moral convictions, because we see that as universal truth. And this is hard. If we are trying to deal with like a lot of the media literacy, we're going to try to talk about this. That's like what I was referencing with like the Dr. Roschke, that other people couldn't take some sources because part of this is moral convictions. Maybe those media sources pushed up against what they perceived morally. And it's really hard to have a conversation. It's really hard to talk about bias and evaluating content and media literacy when someone has a moral conviction versus a personal preference there too. So there's a social distance there, prejudice, anger, civility, antagonism there. And as we're evaluating our bubbles, we have to figure out what are our steel bubbles. What are the really, really hard ones there? And how are our very steel bubbles affecting how we interact online and consume media? So we're going through a who, what, where, when, why. How to take a little segue and to talk about that. If you want to follow that research, it's pretty fascinating. But the who and where. So teaching students that and young people and patrons, not all content is human generated. That's not always a bad thing. Not always a bad thing. It's a weird thing, but it's not always a bad thing. And examining the motivations of where the message came from, and also trying to determine if this was a hacker or a troll. When I say the word troll, if you've heard the phrase "do it for the lulz," a lot of memes, a lot of things out there are shared by people that they're trying to get that emotional response. And so when you just like walk right into their trap, you're giving them what they want. So how do we address these who and where's? And a lot of it comes back to, how is this message affecting me? What is the motivation of the messenger? And how am I interacting in this space there? So technology's changed. It's changed how we access information, how we consume information, how we view information, how we have more information than ever before, but we're not always the best at updating how we teach media literacy. Yes, we need to teach the basics, who, what, where, when, why, but that doesn't always serve us well with how the landscape has changed. So that's my soapbox on this topic. So here are a few more tips to help us with this. When I was in library school and when I was in just college and school in general, I remember like in English class, they would give me like an article. They'd be like, here's this paper, read it, and I want you to evaluate it. I mean, great practice. It's good to look at that, but you're only looking at one piece. So you'd look through, maybe you remember from this library school, this was the author and this is what they said, and this was the date of the article, and this was this, and that good. But with a lot of the bubbles we have online and the landscape is you have to read like laterally. So you have multiple articles on the same topic that you read next to them. So opening up the additional, and this is more work. This is why it's like, I don't want to do any of it, right? This is more work, but if we really want to evaluate some of these sources, you can't necessarily just look at one source. And that's hard and that takes time. But this is something that we need to teach our young people to get in habit of. Let's look at multiple sources and understanding these algorithms. So, you can go into a lot of depth on this. This is just some of the basics out there. Understanding that what's at the top is not necessarily correct. I mentioned earlier in this presentation that in 2016, something big happened. The world switched over to accessing the internet through a mobile device rather than a desktop for the first time in history. Most people get online that way. We have more smart speakers and smart devices in our homes. So if we go and we say, hey Google, what's the distance to the moon? Well, then, yeah, Google's going to give us like the right response, right? But if I'm like, oh, Google, what was, I don't know, what are the causes of the Civil War? Well, that's a little more complicated, right? There's multiple things going on. There's lots of context to that. It's not a simple like black and white answer. So if we are having more voice activated searching, understanding those algorithms, because it's still going to give you the most popular response, but that most popular response is not correct there too. So all their own understanding algorithms is teaching young people about what is search engine optimization. How do websites put keywords and change things to make their sites pop up? to make them more visible, not because they're necessarily the best site, but because they understand the algorithm and they've created that content. It's why blogs are different now. It's not like the mid-aughts, which I miss the 2008 blog world. I had my own little blog, library blog at the time. Everyone did. Now companies have blogs, but they don't have blogs. They have blogs for SEO. They have blogs to get traffic to their site. And it kind of muddies the waters. If you're looking for a legal question, often the first response is maybe law firms, not like a nonprofit, nonpartisan legal think tank. It's law firms. So how does that affect things, and how do our searches affect and cookies and all of this kind of stuff? So this really affects our media landscape, but they're not always taught that. Now, some sites that I would recommend, if you are doing lateral reading, I think All Sides is a great place for that. It actually shows it gives you an article from multiple different sources out there. Here's some other sites out there. PolitiFact will rate the accuracy of the political claims. They have a pretty active Twitter source if you follow politics there. Of course, the American Fact Finder. We're going to get a lot of good data here in a bit now with the US Census. Here's a few other ones. Of course, Snopes, you've probably heard about this, but I really like this informationisbeautiful.net. It does data visualization. Yeah, and I do like Snopes, Caitlin. I feel like there's a lot of good sites out there. I feel like Snopes is the OG site that everyone goes to, but there's some other options. So if I was going to go for a political thing, I might look at PolitiFact over Snopes. If I'm looking at like a pop culture thing, I'm probably going to go to Snopes. Like, did this celebrity do this or whatever there? But yeah, I have not heard of the donut, Rebecca. So thank you for letting me know. Yeah, and I think that's Jed, that's a tricky subject there too. I think that I would talk about like, how are they funded? Does that make sense? That could be one way that you can go about it, that maybe can decrease their bias there. But if they're not liking what they're seeing, if this is pushing back against their moral conviction, remember we talked about that? 1 + 1 = 2 is a moral conviction, then you're not going to be able to convince them much of the bias, because they're reacting a different way. They're in a steel bubble. And I'm not saying that we should engage with people in their steel bubbles, but it's very, 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 very difficult. I think we've seen that with like QAnon this last year, some of these other conspiracy theories. It's very, very hard. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of patience. And it's tough. It's tough with moral convictions. But Follow the Money can help a little bit talking about the bias. Like, where was this funded? What's their money stream? If they are a legitimate nonprofit, they have to do certain reporting. They have to be transparent about a lot of that money. If it's all very closed off and the information is transparent, if it's a foundation that's not necessarily disclosing very openly where their money is going to, then that can be a little bit suspicious. Are there annual financial reports? So nonprofits should have a lot of that. You can also look at like a charity navigator to look at the site there. So I think that's one way to look at it. This term affiliate links, hey, I have an e-commerce site and I use affiliate links, but I'm kind of open about it as a .com site, but if like it means like a link that goes to a source to purchase something and then the person gets a cut of it. So I do a game reviews. I have game review sites and I have affiliate links there. But if they're every single place, and if the blogs are like really weird and like chunky, full of a lot of keywords and not written very well, and they're just link, well, they're just, I'm a little suspicious of that at that point. So these are some ways and this is a way to push against bias. So you're not coming against their moral convictions. You're saying, oh, I understand you might not like that site. I really like it because this is how they're funded and this is where they donate, and they're owned by this person. That could maybe help a little bit. But sometimes this information is harder to find, but if it is very, very hard to find, that is also suspicious too. I know I've covered a lot in here and I have a few more minutes to answer questions. I'm going to just show you a quick of some of my webinar reading list if you want to dive into some of these topics. I love Yuval Noah Harari and Homo Deus. He talks a lot about information and technology and how it affects us. in there. And the shallows talks about how we read as well. And these are some of the references, but I'll go back here and would love to hear from you for the last few minutes here. That's a lot of stuff. I know. Hope I haven't discouraged any of you from this.
All right, thank you, Carrie. So, questions, comments, conversation.
If you're fascinated by the topic of trying to talk with people with moral convictions, I'm a Reddit user and I follow QAnon casualties, and it's just heartbreaking and fascinating. It's like family members of friends who are trying to reach their loved ones, and it's like a case study in trying to work with people. But it takes a long time. It can be heartbreaking. It takes. I asked Dr. Roschke about this because I interviewed her for a book I'm writing about what you do. And she says it's talk about like not the big conspiracy, try to like find very specific things around it and address that. Oh, did this happen in a pizza parlor? Oh, do you think a furniture company was transporting children? Like attack the very specifics, because you can't just go, these conspiracy theories are so vast and so massive that they have an excuse for everything. So you have to go and find the specific piece. That's one tip. But yeah, so it's hard stuff. That's a whole other topic I could dive into, but I know it's affected all of us this last year.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.